Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Indistinct Chatter. I'm Aliza, and today while scrolling socials, I came across a story that caught my eye. And wow, I can't believe I hadn't heard more about this before. News broke in mid-November, and my feed is just now flooded with it. A criminology class at the University of Texas at Arlington helped the Arlington Police Department make an arrest in a 34-year-old cold case murder investigation from 1991. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, but it got me thinking. What other cold cases have been solved because of the assistance of other people who aren't police or FBI or investigators or anyone associated with actually solving the mystery? I really only knew of a couple cases, but it turns out there are many, many more. So get your notepads and magnifying glasses ready. Harness your inner Nancy Drew. We're getting into it today. Now, I love me some good true crime docs and podcasts. I mean, on my docket, just for podcasts alone, I have My Favorite Murder, and That's Why We Drink, Sinisterhood, Wine and Crime, The First Degree, Up and Vanished, Murder, Mystery, and Makeup, Morbid, and probably a bunch more that I'm forgetting right now. But with all of that, I'm obviously still not an expert by any means. So I wanted to give a quick disclaimer before I get too deep in the weeds with you. First, this episode discusses real criminal cases involving violence and murder, so heads up on that. Second, everything I'm sharing comes from publicly available sources like news reports, police statements, court records. I try my best to be as accurate as possible, but I'm not a professional investigator or journalist or even a professional researcher. Third, one of these cases involves someone who has been charged but not convicted, so they're legally presumed innocent. When I talk about that case, the case the UTA students helped with, I'm sharing allegations and what's been reported, not proven facts, okay? Lastly, I'm obviously not a legal professional either. Any information I share is not legal advice, and I am not doing this with the intent to cause harm to anyone involved in these cases. Get it? Got it? Good. Let's get into it. It was an ordinary evening in Arlington, Texas on September 16, 1991. A young single mother, Cynthia Gonzalez, left for work, and sadly, that evening would be the last time anyone would see her alive. The very next day, September 17th, Cynthia's ex-husband reported her missing. It wasn't like her to just go MIA like this. Cynthia was the mother to a 6-year-old daughter, Jessica, and she wouldn't just up and leave without saying anything. Within hours of the missing person report, police found her vehicle abandoned in a neighborhood near the 900 block of Cedar Springs Terrace in Arlington. Cynthia worked as an adult entertainer, dancing for parties and sometimes solo clients, so finding her vehicle abandoned raised major red flags. Detectives began investigating whether Cynthia had possibly been abducted, since her profession meant she met with clients who could potentially become dangerous. The early theory focused on whether one of these encounters had potentially gone horribly wrong. 5 days after Cynthia was reported missing, on September 22nd, 1991, someone made a horrific discovery on a private property in rural Johnson County. The body of an unknown female who had been shot multiple times had been found. Texas is hot, so the victim's body had already begun decomposing in the heat, but by using fingerprint comparison, the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office was able to positively identify the victim as Cynthia Gonzalez. Her family's worst fears had been confirmed. Cynthia hadn't just disappeared. She had been murdered and dumped in a remote area. Detectives followed multiple leads, interviewing people from Cynthia's life, trying to piece together what had happened. And pretty early on, one name kept coming up. Janie Perkins. Janie was a friend of Cynthia's, so the two of them spent time together regularly. Investigators soon discovered that they had something crucial in common. Both women had been romantically involved with the same man. Not only that, but just several weeks before Cynthia's murder, this man told Janie that he was ending their relationship and he wanted to be with Cynthia. Ouch. Obviously, that's going to sting for anyone, right? But for some people, that kind of rejection or betrayal can fester into something much darker. Detectives in the 90s looked hard at Janie, and what they found should have been more than enough to build a case. First, Janie didn't have an alibi. When asked where she was the night Cynthia went missing, Janie couldn't provide a verifiable account of her whereabouts. Second, she failed not one, but 2 polygraph tests. Now, lie detector tests aren't admissible in court, but Janie took these tests voluntarily, and she failed when she was asked these 2 direct questions. 1, did you kill Cynthia Gonzalez? And 2, do you know who killed Cynthia Gonzalez? Not a great look if you fail those. Third, she made some pretty astounding admissions. She told detectives that she was glad Cynthia was dead. She even admitted that she had thought about killing Cynthia herself or having someone else do it. Now, for the record, if any of my friends say shit like this, jail immediately. That is not something that a friend says about a friend. I don't care if it's like a lover's quarrel, a love triangle, whatever. Like, friends don't say shit like that. My friends would never. And if they do, they're not my friend, and arrest them immediately because what the hell? Despite her lack of alibi, failed polygraphs, and saying she was happy her friend was dead, prosecutors in the 90s weren't comfortable filing charges. The evidence was circumstantial, meaning it's indirect proof that relies on reason and logic to establish facts. There wasn't enough physical evidence linking Janie to the crime scene. No witnesses had come forward saying they saw her commit the murder, and no murder weapon was recovered that could be traced to her. In our justice system, you need to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and in 1991, although seriously suspicious, there wasn't enough on Janie to convince prosecutors that they could secure a conviction. So the case went cold. Janie went on with her life. Jessica, Cynthia's daughter, grew up without her mother, without answers, no justice, and no closure. For 34 years, the Cynthia Gonzalez murder case sat in police files. Every once in a blue moon, a detective would pull out the files, review the case, look for new leads, but nothing was materialized. The Arlington Police Department doesn't have a full-time cold case unit, so detectives work on unsolved murders only between their active current investigations. They simply don't have enough detectives, time, or resources to consistently work on these cold cases. In 2024, a homicide detective reviewed the case once again as part of standard practice. After the initial review, the detective found no new evidence or leads to pursue again. The recommendation was to keep the case open for further investigation when possible, but there was nothing concrete to act on. Cynthia's murder seemed like it was sadly destined to remain unsolved. Another tragedy in the files and another family without any answers. But then, something pretty remarkable happened that would change everything. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones kept hearing the same thing from his detectives. There's just not enough time. The detectives wanted to dig into these cold cases and find justice for these families, but they were drowning in active investigations. These files aren't just a page or two. They include hundreds of witness statements and a billion other things. It's not just a quick skim and find more information that might have been missed. These cases could use some fresh eyes to look over old evidence. And that's when an idea was born, an innovative partnership that could revolutionize how we handle cold cases across the country. A professor with a unique background, a police chief willing to think outside the box, and 15 dedicated students would do something extraordinary and crack this case wide open. Now imagine, you're in college, chilling in your classroom, and your professor hands you a flash drive with 500-ish files about a case. And your assignment? You need to find something the police missed. Good luck, have fun! At the beginning of the fall 2025 semester, UTA's Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice partnered with the Arlington Police Department to create a special course on cold case investigations. And this wasn't just some theoretical class where you read about cold cases in textbooks. This was the real frickin' deal. They divided the class into 3 groups, and each group got assigned to an actual unsolved Arlington case to work on. And one of these groups got Cynthia's case. And get this, Professor Patricia Eddings, who led this course, was actually working in forensics with the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Office back in 1991, the same office that identified Cynthia's body. So, for Professor Eddings, this wasn't just some random cold case. She was there. She remembers it. This case had been sitting with her for over 3 decades, and now she had the opportunity to help finally solve it. How full circle is that? So like I mentioned, the students received flash drives with around 500 files. The flash drives included everything from the investigation except the actual physical evidence, photographs from the crime scene, police reports, interview transcripts, witness statements, forensics reports, everything that had been documented about this case for over 30 years. Now, these classes were normally scheduled for 90 minutes, but these students would arrive hours before class started and stay hours after it ended. They were so focused on getting this right, and by the end of their work on the case, they had spent over 100 hours reviewing everything on those flash drives, reading and rereading, trying to find anything that had been missed. Remember, most of the contents on these flash drives were over 30 years old. Back then, people were using pagers. Photos weren't as crisp. They're going over handwritten docs. This certainly wasn't easy, but they knew that on the other side of these files was Jessica Roberts, a real person who deserved real answers about what happened to her mom. And much like in the 90s, the students kept coming back to the same person, Janie Perkins. They kept wondering why she wasn't arrested back then. What are we missing here? With their fresh perspectives on the case, the students compiled 35 specific questions about Janie Perkins and submitted them to Detective Anthony Stafford, who was overseeing Cynthia's case. These questions were targeted, specific inquiries based on patterns they'd noticed in the files. inconsistencies they'd found, and connections they'd made that maybe hadn't seemed important back in 1991. Their questions prompted Detective Stafford and his team to go back into the original case files and dig even deeper. They began re-examining witness statements, and they found something very interesting. There were witnesses, multiple witnesses, who claimed that Janie had admitted to them that she was involved in Cynthia's murder. Not just hints or implications, full-blown admissions. And more than that, Janie had allegedly shared specific details about the killing. Details that, according to investigators, only the murderer would know. Information that wasn't released publicly and not just details you could guess. So when detectives compared what these witnesses said Janie had told them against actual physical evidence from the crime scene, it all clicked. The details Janie allegedly shared with these witnesses aligned with what actually happened at the crime scene. Now, you might be wondering, why wasn't she arrested based on these witness statements back then? Well, it's possible these witnesses came forward later, or maybe they weren't given the attention they deserved at the time. Right now, we don't know all the details, but we do know that these college students asking the right questions led detectives to re-examine this crucial evidence. So on November 6, 2025, the U.S. Marshals North Texas Fugitive Task Force arrested 63-year-old Janie Perkins at her home in Azle, Texas, and she was charged with capital murder in the death of Cynthia Gonzalez. She posted a $150,000 bond and was released, and as of right now, the case is still pending trial. This is so crazy and potentially huge for all cold cases. Fresh eyes with more time to dive deep into cold case files and give new perspectives can potentially give families answers they've been seeking for decades. I mean, proof is in the pudding here. These college students took their class project seriously and solved a murder that had been cold for 34 years. A murder that professional detectives had been unable to crack. A murder that had stumped an entire police department. Arlington Police Chief Al Jones said, quote, "When we launched our cold case partnership with UTA, we always hoped we'd get an outcome like this one day. I don't think any of us expected that lightning would strike the first time. This was the first semester of this program, and they already got an arrest." So cool. For Jessica Roberts, who was 6 when her mother was taken from her, this meant everything. She told reporters that she was shocked, not just that her mother's case was being reviewed, but that it had actually been solved. And there's another really important thing that the students did for Jessica's family. With all their findings, they were able to clear Jessica's late father of any lingering suspicions. It's a sad fact that sometimes in unsolved cases, family members live under a cloud of doubt, and these students were able to definitively say her father had nothing to do with it. Professor Eddings said she couldn't express in words how proud she is of her students. I mean, these students did what seasoned detectives couldn't do. Not that the detectives were bad at their jobs, but because these students had the time, fresh eyes, and the academic rigor to approach the files differently. It's pretty incredible, right? College students solving a 34-year-old murder as a class project. And that's what led me down the rabbit hole. This isn't the only time regular old civilians have cracked cases that stumped professionals. There are many, many more cases where regular people like you and me were able to help solve murders, identify victims, and bring justice to families who had been waiting for answers for decades. Some of these people were true crime writers who became obsessed with the case. Some were Reddit users who crowdsourced investigations. Some were volunteers who dedicated their free time to cold cases. And some were just regular people who happened to take a DNA test for fun and accidentally helped catch a serial killer. So buckle up. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Michelle McNamara and the Golden State Killer. If you're into true crime at all, you've probably heard of the case. Even if you aren't, you might have heard about it. It's pretty iconic. But if you haven't, let me set the scene for you because this is truly wild. Throughout the 70s and 80s, a serial killer and rapist terrorized California. We're talking about someone who committed at least 13 murders, over 50 rapes, and more than 120 burglaries across multiple counties. This guy was absolutely brutal and seemed to move around California at will, striking in different areas and in different jurisdictions. And because this was the 70s and 80s, different police departments in different jurisdictions weren't always communicating well with each other. For a long time, people didn't even realize these crimes were committed by the same person, so he had multiple names depending on where he struck. In some areas, he was called the East Area Rapist. In other places, he was called the Original Night Stalker. He was also known as the Visalia Ransacker. The attacks stopped in 1986, and investigators had basically hit a wall. The case just went cold, and decades passed by, seemingly letting this person get away with it all. Enter Michelle McNamara. Michelle was a true crime writer, and in the mid-2000s, she started a blog called True Crime Diary. She was genuinely fascinated by unsolved cases, and one day she came across information about these crimes in California. Something about these cases grabbed her, and she just couldn't let it go. Again, Michelle was a writer. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't law enforcement. She was really good at research and couldn't stop thinking about this case, so she started digging, like super digging. She spent years researching this case. She worked with online message board communities where other true crime enthusiasts were also trying to piece things together. She hired research assistants to help her go through old records. She traveled to crime scenes and spoke with surviving victims and families of victims. She was determined to find out who this person was. And actually, Michelle's the one credited with coining the name Golden State Killer for this person. Michelle was able to make connections between crimes that hadn't been connected before, confirming they were all done by one person operating across the entire state. That's already a huge break in the case. Detective Paul Holes, who worked on the case for 20 years, called Michelle an investigative partner. He said she talked to people who he hadn't reached and found information that wasn't in police files. I mean, already incredible. A detective referring to a civilian as an investigative partner is a pretty big deal. So Michelle wrote a book about the case. She poured everything she'd learned, all her research, all her theories, everything. It's a great book, but to be honest, I read it during COVID next to an open window at night, and holy shit, it gave me nightmares. It's quite graphic, but filled with so much information. The book is called I'll Be Gone in the Dark and was released in February of 2018. Just 2 months after her book was published, police arrested Joseph James D'Angelo. They got him using genetic genealogy, which we're going to talk about more in a bit. But the point is, after decades of this case being cold, after this guy thought he'd probably gotten away with it for over 30 years, he was finally caught. Michelle's work kept this case in the public eye, and her book reignited interest in solving it. She maintained pressure on law enforcement to keep trying, and she made people care about victims who'd been waiting for justice since the 70s. Sadly, Michelle died in 2016, never seeing her book published or the killer identified and arrested. She never got to see the case she'd dedicated years of her life to finally solved. Her husband, comedian Patton Oswalt, finished and published her book after her death, and when D'Angelo was arrested in April 2018, Patton posted on social media, "I think you got him, Michelle." Like, she did such amazing things, but it's so heartbreaking too. D'Angelo pleaded guilty in 2020 to 13 counts of murder and multiple other crimes. He's now serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice finally served, and a huge part of why is because Michelle, a true crime writer, refused to let the case die. Like the students at UTA, she was able to see everything with a fresh perspective, connecting dots that hadn't been connected before, and able to find new information investigators hadn't been able to find before. This case really showed the world what one dedicated civilian could do. Michelle proved that you don't have to be a cop to make a difference. You just have to care enough not to give up. So what happens when you get a whole community of people working together? Well, friends, that's where Reddit comes in. I know sometimes Reddit can be a cesspool, but honestly, Reddit has some really incredible success stories. Back in 1995, a young hitchhiker was killed in a car crash in Virginia. And what's wild is that nobody knew who this passenger was. He didn't have any ID on him, and the only clues to his identity were 2 ticket stubs in his pocket from Grateful Dead concerts. So he became known as Grateful Doe. For 20 years, Grateful Doe remained unidentified. No one came forward to claim him. No one reported anyone missing in a way that connected them to this case. Then in 2015, a Redditor named Layla Betts stumbled across this case, and something about it just pulled her in. So Layla did what any modern internet sleuth would do. She started a subreddit dedicated to solving this case. The Reddit community rallied around Grateful Doe and started working on photo reconstructions of what he might have looked like, sharing the case far and wide, crowdsourced the investigation, and various people brought different skills to the table. And it worked. Through all this community effort, Grateful Doe was finally identified as Jason Callahan. He was just 19 years old when he died, and after 2 decades of being unknown, he finally had his name back. His family finally knew what happened to him, all thanks to a random person on Reddit coming across his story and caring enough to create a community of other people who cared enough to put in the effort to identify him. But that's not the only Reddit success story. Back in the 70s, a woman's remains were found, but investigators couldn't identify her. The case went cold for decades, and she became another Jane Doe in the system. Then a sleuthing Redditor got interested and started digging through public records, including cemetery records, autopsy reports, basically anything they could find that was publicly available. And all that information led to a forensic artist being able to reconstruct what the victim's face might have looked like. Folks shared the reconstruction image, and eventually the remains were identified as Linda Pagano. Another family finally got answers after decades of not knowing. How amazing is that? Now, it's important to note that Reddit doesn't always get it right. There's actually a pretty infamous example of Reddit sleuths getting it very, very wrong. During the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, Reddit users tried to identify the bomber, and they wrongly accused innocent people, which caused real harm to people who had nothing to do with the bombing. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of amateur internet sleuthing without proper oversight. But Reddit isn't the only platform where volunteers are helping solve cold cases. There's a website called uncovered.com, which was founded in 2019 by Jim Brown. It's specifically designed to crowdsource volunteer investigators in a more organized way. Basically, from what I understand, they create detailed profile pages for unsolved cases and compile all the publicly available information like police reports, news articles, witness statements, and they make it all accessible in one place. Then volunteers can review the information, offer tips, make connections, and help keep cold cases in the public eye. It's a more structured approach to crowdsourced investigation. The internet, whether you love it or hate it, has created opportunities for people to collaborate on solving mysteries in ways that were never possible before. 30 years ago, you would probably be on your own, but now you can find a whole community of people who care about a case just as much as you do, no matter where they are in the world. And that's pretty cool. But remember, it's important when the community efforts are focused on the right things. Identifying unknown victims is amazing and great work. Reviewing old evidence in cold cases is helpful. Trying to identify active suspects in ongoing investigations is where things can go wrong fast. When done right, crowdsourced investigation can be incredibly powerful, but when done wrong, it can ruin innocent people's lives. So wouldn't you say that's all pretty neat? Students with a fresh perspective solving a cold case, Redditors banding together to identify the unidentified. Now I want to gab to you about another game changer in solving cold cases: genetic genealogy and DNA databases. Remember when I mentioned that the Golden State Killer was ultimately caught using genetic genealogy? It's quite fascinating. Basically, investigators have DNA from a crime scene, right? Maybe it's from blood or saliva or hair, whatever might have been left behind. They run the DNA through CODIS, which is the FBI's criminal DNA database. But if the perp has never been arrested or had their DNA taken before, there's not going to be a match in CODIS. Dead end, right? Well, someone with a lumpy brain had a brilliant idea. What if we upload the crime scene DNA to a public genealogy database? You know, like the ones people use when they want to find out their ancestry or connect with long-lost relatives. Have you ever done one? I have, and it is cooler than you might think. Aside from finding some long-lost relatives, I like to check to see what my ancestry is. At one point, I was 50% Norwegian descent, but now it says I'm 60% based on new data. Sometimes it says I'm a little Russian. Sometimes it says I'm a little Swedish. It updates constantly with more and more data that's being uploaded and studied. It's also cool because it shows how DNA can kind of guess your traits. And for the most part, everything it's guessed is pretty accurate for me. For example, based on my DNA, it says I'm left foot dominant, that I prefer savory food, and that I like cilantro. It also says I have dimples and dark eyes and that I am not athletically inclined. It even knows that based on my DNA, I am likely to get hangry and that I'm more likely to get motion sickness. It's pretty cool. DNA can build quite the picture. It's not 100% accurate though. I mean, it said that I'm a morning person, which I certainly am not. If I wake up too early, my tummy hurts, but it's cool nevertheless. But anyway, they upload the crime scene DNA, and even if the actual criminal has never taken a DNA test, their distant relatives might have. Maybe it's a third cousin who wanted to learn about their Irish heritage. Maybe it's a second cousin once removed who was curious about their family tree. These people have no idea they might be related to a criminal, but their DNA is out there in these public databases. So when investigators get a match to a distant relative, they can build out family trees and use genealogy records, birth certificates, marriage records, all that good stuff to figure out who in the family could have been in the right place at the right time to commit the crime. They keep doing this until they have a suspect. Then they verify it by getting a direct DNA sample from that person. If not by a court order, sometimes by their trash, or a discarded coffee cup, or a tissue, or something like that, which is exactly how they ultimately caught the Golden State Killer. Remember, Michelle McNamara spent years researching him and keeping the case in the public eye, and genetic genealogy ultimately identified him. Investigators uploaded the crime scene DNA to GEDmatch, got a hit on a distant relative, built out family trees, and eventually narrowed it down to D'Angelo. They confirmed it all by getting DNA from a car door handle and a tissue he discarded. After hiding in plain sight for decades, a 72-year-old former police officer was finally identified as one of California's most prolific serial killers. Crazy, right? I want to scream. It's so cool. And this method seems to be doing pretty well for itself. Hundreds of cold cases have been solved using genealogy. It's pretty amazing. In 1974, over 50 years ago, a woman named Mary Kay Schley was hitchhiking in Wisconsin, and she was tragically stabbed to death. Her case went cold for 5 decades. Then in 2024, investigators used genetic genealogy and identified an 84-year-old man named John Miller as her killer. When police confronted him with the DNA, Miller just came out and admitted to killing her. 50 years and this man almost got away with it. But thanks to someone in his family taking a DNA test, he's finally being held accountable. In 1996, a 15-year-old girl named Danielle Houchins vanished in Montana. Her case went cold, but then investigators used genealogical analysis and matched DNA to a man named Paul Hutchinson, who had no prior connection to Danielle that anyone knew about. Unfortunately, within 24 hours of police making contact with him, Paul took his own life. DNA testing later confirmed the match, so Danny's family got answers, but they'll never see their daughter's killer face justice in court. In Las Vegas, there's a volunteer group called the Vegas Justice League that has helped fund genetic testing for cold cases since 2020. And they've already helped solve 9 cases, including a cold case from 1994 when a woman named Melanie White was found murdered near Lake Mead. The Vegas Justice League funded new genetic tests on evidence from her case, and they were able to identify a man named Arthur Lavery as the killer. He had died before he was identified, but Melanie's family, including her son, who was just a baby when she was murdered, finally got an answer to her murder. And then there's the baby Garnett case from 1997. A newborn baby was found dead in a camp latrine in Michigan, and for 25 years, no one knew who this baby was or who the parents were. Then someone took an at-home DNA test like 23andMe or Ancestry, and that eventually led investigators to identify the baby's mother. In 2001, Leslie Preer was murdered in Maryland, and her case went unsolved for 23 years, with her husband living under a cloud of suspicion the entire time. Investigators worked with a genetic genealogy company called Ortham, which the Vegas Justice League works with too, and created an enhanced DNA profile from evidence at the scene. The detectives spent about a year and a half building out family trees from all the DNA matches. This isn't overnight work, obviously. DNA isn't just wham bam, thank you ma'am. We share 50% DNA with our parents, then 25% with our grandparents, and each generation of separation decreases genetic similarities by a quarter. So for example, you share only about 12.5% DNA with your first cousins. And not everyone in the world is in the system, so unless a family really got together and studied their genealogy, investigators aren't going to get a solid hit right away. So in this case, the highest match they found traced back to a Romanian family and eventually connected them to Eugene Gligor, who turned out to be Leslie's daughter's high school boyfriend. Eugene pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in May 2024, clearing Leslie's husband after 2 decades of living under suspicion. The scale of this is just mind-blowing, really. We're talking about over 600 cold cases involving murder or sexual assault that have been solved using DNA. Law enforcement calls it a game changer, obviously, and states are allocating money specifically for cold case genetic genealogy testing. Washington State, for example, put aside $500,000 in 2023-2024 in order to identify any and all unidentified human remains. And Colorado allocated $3 million from its general fund to retest around 3,000 DNA samples. And what's so cool is that this technology clearly works on decades-old DNA samples. So cases from 30, 40, 50 years ago that seemed impossible to solve are suddenly being cracked wide open. But of course, there are some serious ethical questions here. First, I think it's important to note that a huge reason Colorado set aside so much money to retest DNA samples was because of a lab scandal. I can maybe go over that another time, but it's a reminder that with all good things, there can always be a bad apple or two. Second, when you take a DNA test to learn about your ancestry or find relatives, you're probably not thinking about consenting to help police investigate crimes. But if your third cousin commits a murder, your DNA in that database could be what leads police to them. You're essentially bringing your entire extended family into a police investigation without any of them knowing or agreeing to it. I mean, if you uploaded your DNA to any of those at-home testing places, you could potentially be under investigation right now and not even know it. Personally, I think if it helps catch murderers and rapists, that's worth it. It's actually one of the reasons I did my ancestry tests. I heard about the DNA testing resulting in cold cases being solved when I heard about the Golden State Killer. And I figured, okay, why not? And also, why not learn about my heritage a little? But I also understand why people aren't comfortable with it. I mean, huge privacy concerns, right? What if our DNA is misused? Luckily, these databases are just voluntary. You don't have to do them. I chose to upload my DNA and believe that if my DNA is used to solve a crime, it's not to find someone with outstanding parking tickets. But we live in a crazy world, so maybe someday, family, my DNA might get you busted for that. But to be honest, I'd be the one who probably has an outstanding parking ticket. I seem to collect them quite a lot, and I have one right now, actually. And from what I can tell, it seems most families of victims are just grateful to finally have answers. Think about Melanie White and Cynthia Gonzalez again. Their children had to grow up without their mother and without answers. But thanks to DNA testing, they finally have those answers. Finally, some amount of closure after decades of not knowing. And like I mentioned earlier, the technology is always improving with more time and more information. DNA databases are growing exponentially as more and more people take these ancestry tests. The techniques for building family trees and narrowing down suspects are getting more and more refined, and this isn't going away anytime soon. If anything, it's going to become even more powerful as a tool for solving cold cases. Whether you think it's amazing or unsettling, you're just having fun finding out if you're French or Turkish, and boom, you might be the reason a cold case is solved. We started this episode learning about how college students in Texas solved a 34-year-old murder. We learned about Michelle McNamara's dedication to tracking down the Golden State Killer. We covered Reddit communities identifying unknown victims, and we dove into how genetic genealogy is revolutionizing cold case investigations. It's all very, very fascinating, if you ask me. And the common thread is that you don't have to be a professional detective, FBI agent, or trained investigator to make a difference. Fresh eyes, new perspectives, and dedicated people who refuse to give up can crack cases that have stumped law enforcement for decades. But remember, this does not mean we should all go out and start playing detective on the internet, okay? Remember what I said about the Boston Marathon bombing? Amateur sleuthing without proper oversight, without working with law enforcement, without ethical boundaries, can destroy innocent people's lives. We need to be smart about it and not take the law into our own hands. We got to work with law enforcement and not against them. And most importantly, we need to make sure we are respecting the victims and their loved ones. Sometimes true crime obsession can get icky. It can become exploitative for various reasons, whether it's for entertainment or vanity or whatever. So maybe check out organizations like the Vegas Justice League, or maybe a college near you has something similar to what UTA is doing. The goal is to find truth and justice, not internet fame, okay? All in all, this episode was about cold cases being solved by civilians, but I think it just reignited some hope for me. Hope that there are families out there waiting for answers who will finally get them and be able to close a horrific chapter on their lives. Obviously, they won't get their loved ones back, but maybe they'll get some sense of comfort knowing that the monster who took them or hurt them is finally locked away. And maybe you might be inspired to look into cold cases in your area. A hot topic is Peggy Hetrick's case. A young man was wrongfully committed and sentenced to life in 1999. In 2008, the conviction was overturned and charges dropped after the case was reopened and new DNA evidence emerged. Remember, don't overstep, but maybe one thing you can do is keep the story alive with respect to the victim and their family, of course. Maybe you'll take a DNA test that helps solve a decades-old murder, or maybe you'll be the one to ask the question that cracks a case wide open. Or maybe you'll just have a deeper appreciation for the people who are doing the work, like students, volunteers, true crime writers, everyday people like you and me who refuse to let the case fade away. Everyday people making extraordinary differences. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you for joining me in this rabbit hole. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. Maybe you know of a case I didn't mention that was solved by DNA testing or regular people going down their own rabbit holes. Feel free to leave a comment, follow on Instagram, or send an email. We'll chat again next week. And until then, be safe, be kind, and take care of your lumpy brain. Love ya. Love you. Bye.